Hi, Kay. How are you?
Hi, Tanya. Um, okay, so I have a quick question about the business, like trade business, let's say constructions or plumbing or HVACs and those business,
Yeah.
which the way they operated, they do the owner or the company usually have license to operating, kind of the owner operating on it. So when they want to sell, what happened with the new owner? I mean, who is the buyer? Do they have to be the one who already have license? Let's say contractor, general contractor license, or the licensing can transfer, or how it works, in that kind of business.
So it depends. If the contractor's license is in the business name, you have what's called an RMO, a responsible managing officer, or an RME, which would be a responsible managing employee. So you have to have an RMO or an RME in order for the business to operate. And those RMOs and RMEs have contractor licenses themselves. If the contractor's license, like I said, is at the corporate level, assuming it's a corporation, if the contractor's license is in the name of the seller, in their personal name, then they have to sell to somebody who already has a contractor's license, typically. Or they can become the responsible managing officer. The buyer would have to give them 10% stock in a new corporation, and they could be an RMO for that corporation for a period of time. They can't be an RME if there's an SBA loan involved, because under the SBA guidelines, the seller cannot be an employee. But they can be an RMO because they can be an officer of the corporation temporarily, but no longer than a year. And that's kind of special additional contract that you need to have an attorney draw up and all of that. So
when you say drop the attorney, who's responsible for that cost? Would that be the buyer, the seller? Or the split?
The buyer.
Buyer.
I mean, if the buyer is trying to buy a business where they're not licensed, they don't have the license required to operate the business, then it's their expense. They need to, if the seller agrees to be an RMO, the buyer's going to need to have their attorney draw up a contract and an RMO agreement and have that negotiated.
Okay, so if the seller willing to do, let's say, training for about 3 to 6 months, and the positions, they still have license hanging the business, would that work, until the business established? Let's say after 6 months, then they can transfer RMO, IME afterward?
Well, the business, the owner of the, so again, it depends, because if the contractor's license is in the seller's name, then once escrow closes, the buyer now owns the business, but the buyer can't operate the business without a license.
Mm-hmm.
So the buyer has to either have a corporate license and then an RMO, or they can have, they can have just an RMO even under their own, company name or whatever. But all of that takes time to go through the contractor's licensing board anyway. So those applications and things have to be submitted, and your escrow period is probably going to be longer than 30 days. I mean, the licensing needs to be in place before escrow closes, because otherwise, from the time escrow closes until the time the licensing is in place, the business can't operate. So then you have a disruption of cash flow.
Okay. So if the purchase and sales agreement both buyer and seller agree to have that out of the escrow licensing transfer. So can the escrow close? The reason I'm asking because I have one scenario kind of similar with the restaurant. So does buyer and seller agree to split the escrow for the alcohol licensing and then the business to two escrow? So the business can run it as soon as escrow closed, while the hard legal license still going on. It usually takes about a few months. So is that kind of similar scenario with the licensing contractor stuff?
Well, you're in California, right?
Yes.
Okay, so under the Business and Professions Code in California, when it comes to contractors' licenses, the laws are extremely strict. At the point in time where a contractor is, where a license is suspended or not active, then the person doing the work is not entitled to any compensation. And further, if any compensation has been paid to that company, the client or customer can basically sue to get that returned to them. Okay? So anybody doing business without a contractor, without a valid contractor's license already in place, the way it's supposed to be, is considered to be operating as an unlicensed party and is not entitled to any compensation at all.
Okay.
So it just becomes very problematic.
Yeah.
And it's something that you should be very careful of. Now, when it comes to a restaurant and a liquor license, an escrow cannot close. Typically, when you have a liquor license, it's being transferred. The escrow does not close until the liquor license transfers. That's what allows escrow to close. So where you're saying that can be split up, I suppose it could, as long as the restaurant stops serving alcohol. I mean, they have to, they can't, if they're not licensed properly or the license is in somebody else's name, then they can't serve. So again, you get into a situation where you're potentially disrupting the cash flow of the business. And sometimes it's better to have a longer escrow that's 90 days or 120 days or however long it's going to take to do things properly and make sure all the ducks are in a row and all the I's are dotted and T's crossed. Because if you try and play games that are, if you don't get it right, if the buyer and seller don't get it right, and there ends up being a disruption to the business, the buyer is going to hire an attorney that's going to sue the seller and that's going to sue you as a broker because you were involved in it or involved in discussions or maybe made suggestions or whatever, but you'll get caught up in it. So it's better just to tell the parties, look at, get your advice from your attorneys, respective attorneys. I'm not going to give you advice on how to, if you want to divide this up or do whatever, you have your legal counsel tell you how to do that in a lawful manner, because I'm a broker and I don't get involved in that.
Yeah.
Just get away from that.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Of course.